6 of the top 10 AP teams lost last week, and one of the few who did not, Tennessee, takes the top spot in the very important Week 6 AP poll.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoops show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host for today's show, Andy Patton, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day throughout the offseason, in the regular season, in the NCAA tournament, all the time. We are here for you. I want to give a special shout out to our everyday listeners and those of you joining us on the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. And remind you all that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and if you win, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, how does the Week 6 AP poll differ from the Locked On College Basketball Top 25 rankings? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what the differences are and why, plus a look at the top 12 teams in the AP poll and whether our national champion is among them, for which would be the 22nd straight season that has been the case. And then we're going to close out the show with a preview of the Jimmy V Classic, 2 fun games going on at Madison Square Garden today, and then a couple of Big Ten battles to talk about as well. The AP Top 25 was released Monday morning. It's Week 6. It's the middle of the non-conference slate. It was kind of coming into a slow week of college basketball, but there is a key important metric with the Week 6 AP poll. We kind of teased it there in the opener, but for the last, since 2003, every NCAA tournament champion has been ranked inside the top 12 of the AP poll after Week 6, or the Week 6 AP poll, I should say. So I believe that means there have been 20 champions, since we did not have a champion in the 2020 season. So this would actually be the 21st season. So got that wrong in the open there. Apologies. Regardless, we're going to talk in the second segment more about who these 12 teams are and who is maybe not in that conversation. But what we want to do now is take a look at the AP Top 25, the biggest riser, the biggest fallers, the differences, all of the teams that are 5 spots or more different than where our rankings came in. If you want to see the Locked On College Basketball rankings, we publish them every week on Monday morning, publish them on the YouTube community tab. If you're watching on YouTube, we post them on social media as well. We have a Twitter account, Locked On CBB. You can follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky. We're starting to post over there as well. The Discord channel, we post the top 25 there. So if you want to find it, plenty of different spots that you can check it out there. I'll run through the teams in the top 25 for the AP here very quickly. Tennessee is the new number 1. They are undefeated. They were one of 4 top 10 teams in last week's top 10 who did not lose. They were the highest ranked out of those, so they moved to number 1. I don't think it should always be that simple, but in this case, Tennessee is the team that deserves to be number 1 in the rankings, so I think that they got that one right. Auburn is 2, Iowa State's 3, Duke is 4, Kentucky is 5. There is a lot of conversation on social media about the placement of Duke and Kentucky. In particular, it felt like Kentucky was going to drop at least 1 spot due to losing to Clemson, even after their big comeback win over Gonzaga. But the fact that they're right behind Duke, who they beat earlier this season, I know head-to-head battles don't matter, shouldn't be the sole reason for ranking a team the way that they do. And again, the AP is not ranked by one person, so it's a conglomerate of hundreds of different people's rankings. But yeah, I can understand why Big Blue Nation's not thrilled being 1 spot behind a team they already beat. Marquette's at number 6, Alabama's at 7, Gonzaga's at number 8, Florida at 9, Kansas at 10. They're the biggest dropper, going from 1 to 10 after losing 2 last week. Purdue's at 11, Oregon's at 12. Again, we'll talk about that specific group of 12 teams a little later in the show. Oklahoma moves all the way up to 13. Michigan is at 14. Strong start to the season for Dusty May's club. Houston at 15. Clemson at 16. A&M at 17. UConn moves from 25 up to 18 after beating Baylor and Texas last week. Ole Miss, another SEC team, a lot of them in these rankings, they're at 19. The Badgers of Wisconsin, another big faller, they fall down to 20. Michigan State at 21. Cincinnati at 22. San Diego State, UCLA, and Mississippi State round out our top 25. So the biggest riser in the AP poll was Oklahoma, who went from 21st to 13th, 8 spots up. And look, again, the AP poll is a conglomerate of hundreds of different people, or I think 100-ish people who do the top 25. So you can't really get mad at every voter when you see something that you don't like. But one of the trends we frequently see with AP voters is kind of just blindly moving teams up when they win, where when they don't lose, or more probably more likely moving teams down when they do lose, which results in a situation where an Oklahoma team that struggled against a not good Georgia Tech team, they won. They beat Georgia Tech. They beat Alcorn State. And you're saying that those 2 wins take them from 21st to 13th? I'm just not sure I buy it. We ranked Oklahoma. I believe Oklahoma deserves to be ranked in the bottom half of the top 25, probably closer to 25. I don't think this is a top 15 team in the country right now. With apologies to Porter Moser, I like this club. I like what we've seen from Jeremiah Fears, but it felt like they just got a big bump while a lot of other teams kind of bumped down. And 13th just feels like kind of an eye-popping aberration for a team that went 2-0 last week, but wasn't particularly convincing in their 2 wins. And seeing them, representing the SEC ahead of Texas A&M, ahead of Ole Miss, ahead of Mississippi State, just feels a little odd. I don't think they're better than any of those teams, quite honestly. And I think it's a little bit of just kind of the weird wonkiness you sometimes see with aggregated top 25s in this situation, where just too many people kind of moved them up or moved other teams down blindly because, well, they didn't lose, so they're going to stay up there. And it resulted in them being higher in the standings than I think that they probably deserve to be. The biggest fallers, we already said Kansas and Wisconsin. Those are the 2 correct teams to be the biggest fallers because they were the 2 teams that lost twice last week. Kansas, of course, losing to Creighton in that game early on in the week, and then losing the border war to Missouri. Wisconsin took a couple tough losses as well. They lost to Michigan, and then they lost to Marquette. That game against Marquette, one of those 2 teams was going to take 2 losses that week. Wisconsin ends up being the team that does. They're still in the top 25. They still deserve to be in the top 25, but they're a team that is kind of holding on to that spot. We'll see if they can pick up some big W's as conference play. They got some more non-conference games coming up. They got Illinois on Tuesday. We're actually going to talk about that game coming up here in a second. We'll see if they can pick up a win there. If not, they might not even be in the top 25 by the time next week rolls around. And then here are the biggest differences between our rankings for Locked On College Basketball and then the AP top 25. We already kind of talked about Oklahoma. So they're 13th in the AP poll. They're 22nd in our rankings for Locked On College Basketball. I won't talk much more about them. We've already kind of litigated a lot of that. Oregon is another team. They're 12th in the AP poll, 17th in our rankings. Not a huge difference there. I'm fairly skeptical on Oregon. They lost to a good UCLA team. I don't think that's a devastating loss for them, although it was at home. So losing to a team that is borderline top 25 at home doesn't exactly bode well for Oregon being considered a top 12 team in this AP poll. Kwame Evans hasn't really played all that well. I do know that Dana Altman's team have a tremendous history of really finding themselves in January. Like, that is Dana's month. And this team has been better in the non-conference portion of the season than they typically are. So maybe they'll turn it around, have a really good month of January, be a top 5, top 3 team in the Big Ten, and totally look deserving of a top 12, even top 10 spot in the polls. But color me skeptical that Oregon is going to stay in this top 25, top 15, or even top 20, 25 conversation throughout the year. Houston is a team that's going the other direction. They're 15th in the AP poll. We had them 10th at Locked On College Basketball. Again, I think they're just getting that people see 3 losses and bump them down a little bit. And sure, I'm not saying they should be top 5 or like they were at the beginning of the year, but their losses are to Auburn, number 2, to Alabama, who's a top 10 team, and then to San Diego State, who snuck into the top 25 as well. The San Diego State loss is not great for Houston, but it's also not terrible. The problem for Houston right now is they haven't had a lot of opportunities to pick up super quality wins. They beat Butler and they beat Notre Dame. Neither of those are bad wins, but they're not great wins. They shouldn't be your 2 best wins. So for Houston, it's just a matter of when they get more opportunities, when they get into conference play, they get those opportunities against the Baylors and Arizonas and Kansases and Iowa States of the world. We'll see how they do at that point. I think this team's going to be just fine. I think we'll end up talking about them as a top 10 team more often than not this season. And then UCLA, 24th in the AP poll, 15th in our rankings. That's pretty high for where we have them right now. But again, UCLA is a team that only has one loss. The loss was to a pretty good New Mexico team on a neutral floor. They beat Oregon on the road. They also beat Washington, who's not very good, but they're 2-0 in Big Ten play. Only got one loss, and it's not a bad loss. I can understand why they're kind of in that conversation. Rapid fire here, the teams that we ranked that the AP did not rank, and then the teams that the AP ranked that we did not rank. We had St. John's 19th. They picked up 43 votes from AP voters. We like what we've seen from them. Zuby Ejiofor has been an absolute monster this season. I would not be surprised to see this team climb back into that conversation. Maryland, we had them 23rd. They picked up 39 AP votes. Their two losses are to Marquette and Purdue by 4 and 5. Those are two of the best teams in the country, and they barely lost to both of them. They got a nice win over Villanova. They got a thrashing of Ohio State, who they beat by 24. A lot of people talked about how negative that loss was for Ohio State, but I'm not sure Maryland got enough attention for winning that one the way that they did. And then we had Dayton in our top 25. They picked up 38 AP votes as well. Again, 2-point loss to North Carolina, 5-point loss to Iowa State. Beat UConn, they beat Northwestern, they beat New Mexico State, who picked up a nice win over New Mexico. Dayton faces Marquette, hosts Marquette on Saturday, a really good chance to prove that they do in fact belong in this conversation. And then Michigan State, San Diego State, and Mississippi State, who are 21st, 23rd, and 25th respectively in the AP poll, all did not make our top 25, although they all got votes from 2 out of the 3 of us. So they were very, very close. So not a ton we need to say there. All teams that are kind of right in that mix being top 25 squads at this point. Well, folks, every single year since 2003, like we said, the national champion has been ranked inside the top 12 of the AP poll during week 6. Will that trend continue in 2025, or are there teams outside the top 12 that we think are realistic national title contenders? We're going to talk about that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the NFL action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5, and if you win, you'll get $150 in bonus bets. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. We're going to talk about the games coming up on tonight on Tuesday. Michigan favored by 5.5 points over Arkansas at Madison Square Garden as part of the Jimmy V Classic. We'll talk about that game, the other game in Jimmy V, and a couple of Big Ten games to close out the show. If you like any of these odds, you feel confident about those games, visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch, and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're still talking about the AP poll on today's show, as week 6 has been a long time catalyst for being able to determine who is going to be the upcoming national champion. Again, every year since 2003, outside of 2020 when there was not an NCAA tournament, the champion was ranked inside the top 12 of the AP poll in week 6. So here are the 12 teams in the top, ranked in the top 12, that are now contenders to be national champions if this data were to hold for a 21st consecutive season. Tennessee first, Auburn, Iowa State at 3, Duke at 4, Kentucky at 5, Marquette at 6, Bama at 7, Gonzaga at 8, Florida at 9, Kansas at 10, Purdue at 11, and Oregon at 12. So there's 2 questions. Do we think the 2025 national champion is among these 12 teams? And then who are teams that could spoil this, could ruin this statistic that has long been used by people like myself and Trilly Donovan and Evan Miyakawa and others who collect data, who post about college basketball. They're all talking about it on social media today. This has been a long time storyline in college basketball, that week 6 is really a time when you can start to separate the teams that are really legitimate contenders or not. But there are some teams that we feel could potentially compete for national champions that aren't in this top 12. Let's talk about the 12 that we do have, because it's a pretty darn good group. Like if you were taking the betting odds, if somebody, FanDuel or another betting partner, were to do these 12 teams or the field, I think you'd probably take these 12 teams. Typically, you want to take the field majority of the time, But this is a group of teams that have very obvious national title contenders. You have teams that are perennially competing for national titles like Duke and Kansas and Gonzaga, and recently teams like Marquette and Alabama and Purdue, of course. You have teams that aren't always traditionally in this conversation, but have looked very dominant in the early going, like Tennessee and Auburn and Iowa State. You have a Florida team that has looked very, very good and has kind of flown under the radar a little bit. You have a Kentucky team that Kentucky's typically in this conversation. They haven't been as much lately under Coach Cal, but man, Mark Pope's got this team rolling. They got some injuries right now. We'll see how much that impacts them. Kirk Kriisa out indefinitely after suffering a non-contact injury in the second half against Gonzaga. We'll see if we get an update there. Lamont Butler didn't play in that game, although it sounds like he will be back a little bit sooner. Regardless, that's a really good group of teams. We kind of left Oregon out of that conversation. I already said my spiel about Oregon earlier. I feel like they're the least likely of these teams to be legitimate national title contenders the way they've played at this point, but they're certainly not. There's no shame in being the worst of the 12 teams kind of in the conversation to be a national title. And we'll see again, Dana Altman's teams tend to peak a little later in the season. So perhaps that's still coming for this team out of Eugene. But I do think you're looking at a group of teams here that reasonably could do this. When you look at KenPom data, the KenPom top 20 teams, or teams that are ranked in the top 20 in both adjusted offensive efficiency and adjusted defensive efficiency, Tennessee is, Duke is, Houston is, Iowa State is, Marquette is. So all those teams are in this conversation except Houston. We're going to talk about Houston in a second. The FanDuel odds, not saying the FanDuel odds should be taken as gospel in terms of evaluating this kind of data specifically, but it's notable that FanDuel has Auburn at the top. They have Duke number 2. They have Gonzaga and Houston tied for the third best odds. Kentucky's after that. UConn, Bama, Iowa State, Kansas. All of those teams are there except Houston again and UConn. So let's talk about that. Because to me, it feels like there are pretty clearly two teams that are not in this top 12 that feel like legitimate title contenders. And of course, it's going to be UConn and Houston. There's no real secret about the teams that we're talking about here. Houston right now is 5th at KenPom. Their adjusted offensive efficiency is 11th. Their adjusted defensive efficiency is 3rd. Again, they have a 5-3 record, which for people who are filling out their AP poll every week are seeing 3 losses and struggling to justify putting a team that has 3 losses in the top 10 or top 12 over a team like Oregon that only has 1 loss, or some of the other teams that are, Florida doesn't have any losses at this point. Like, I can understand why AP voters are hesitant to rank a 3-loss Houston team over some of the teams that are ahead of them, while in reality, I think Houston is probably a more complete team than Oregon for sure, than maybe Florida even in that conversation. But, you play such a dominant schedule early on. You lose to Auburn, you lose to Bama, you lose to San Diego State, which again, the San Diego State loss is not great, but nobody's going to be nobody's going to be furious at Oregon for having that loss. Granted, they did win that game, but it just doesn't feel like a loss that is that critical. It's just the fact that it's also on top of these other losses to Bama and Auburn, who again are not teams that it's that problematic to have lost to at this point. The main issue for Houston is not having the marquee wins. Butler and Notre Dame, just not great wins. They're going to need to pick up those better wins, but I'm not betting against Kelvin Sampson. They've done this before. This is a team that has a lot of pieces back from their previous seasons. Yes, they lost Jamal Shed, and yes, they haven't replaced him with a pure point guard. Milos Uzan is very good, but he's not a distributor the way that Jamal Shed was. LJ Cryer is more of a score-first guard. He's not really the distributor, but they're still a great defensive team. They're finding their own offensively. Terrence Arsenault had a really good game recently. He's kind of starting to look more like the guy we thought he was when he was a freshman before he got hurt. Emmanuel Sharp continues to be a big piece. Their front court players have been just dominant on the glass for this team. I think this team, if anybody's going to spoil it, it's either Houston or UConn, and I wouldn't be surprised if Houston is the team that kind of breaks this streak here. But we have to talk about UConn too, because they're back-to-back national champions. Mathematically eliminating the back-to-back national champion UConn Huskies because they're not in the top 12 in week 6 feels a little silly, even if this data has been proven to be true time and time again over the last couple of decades. Obviously, we know why UConn's not in the top 12. They went 0-3 in the Maui Invitational. That included some not great losses, lost to Dayton, lost to Colorado. Not terrible losses, but in conjunction, and then the loss to Memphis, just not good. Again, UConn rebounded, picked up a home win over Baylor, picked up a road win over Texas. But here's the deal with UConn. Their KenPom adjusted offensive efficiency is third. They're the third best offense in the country. Their KenPom adjusted defensive efficiency, 93rd. No champion, I believe, has been below 22. Now, again, UConn's defense is probably going to get better. They're not going to finish the year 93rd. That would be very surprising to me if they were to finish the season that bad defensively. But they are nowhere close on that end of the floor to being a national championship team. It's just a fact. It is just a straight up fact based on the decades of data that we have using KenPom information that this team defensively does not pass the test in terms of what you need to be as a national champion. But again, Danny Hurley's really good at what he does. They're going to figure it out. They're going to find ways to make this team better. They held Texas to 65 points in a game where Aiden Mahaney played 6 minutes. As I said on Monday's show, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Aiden Mahaney is hurting them defensively, and I think there's a chance that his playing time gets limited until they figure out how to help make him more impactful on that end of the floor. Are there other teams besides Houston and UConn that could contend for national titles? Of course, anybody could. This rule is not hard and fast in the way that some other rules might be, but it has happened this way for a reason. I think Houston and UConn are the most likely teams, the teams that are going to be most discussed in this conversation this week. Baylor strikes me as a team that could get in this conversation. They're not even in the top 25 right now, but they're a team that has dealt with injuries. Langston Love was out. VJ Edgecombe has been out for a bit. I think they're a team that has a lot of veteran experience. Once Scott Drew kind of gets all the pieces in line, I worry about their front court depth. And I think that could be a factor that ultimately inhibits them from being a true title contender. But among unranked teams, they're certainly my top choice right now. Michigan and Michigan State, certainly worth keeping an eye on. I like the roster construction. Tom Izzo's phenomenal in March. You don't want to bet against him. And I'll toss out Chris Beard and Ole Miss. They're a team that's looked very good in the early going, really talented roster. Chris Beard's a very strong coach. So they're a team that I think you want to keep an eye on if you're looking at teams outside of this top 12 that you think could realistically contend to cut down the nets in March. Well, we've been talking a lot about Tennessee on today's show. They draw Miami in their first game as the number one team in the country, with Michigan and Arkansas being the other game in the Jimmy V Classic. We're going to break those matchups down and a pair of games in the Big Ten, all coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. It's guaranteed perfection in every single bite. And folks, right now you can save on unforgettable gifts with 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus, score an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. With 5 generations of experience, they consistently deliver the world's best steak experience, and the gifting experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages featuring gourmet favorites. From legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide for a limited time at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. Minimum purchase may apply. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Closing out the show, giving you a preview of 4 games taking place tonight, today, Tuesday, December 10th here. Again, we didn't have much action on Monday to talk about, but we've got a few good games kind of sprinkled throughout the rest of the week here. Most schools are in finals week right now, so a lot of teams had a game on Saturday and don't have a game again until next Saturday. So there's just not a ton of exciting midweek action, but we do got some fun games here. The Jimmy V Classic, 2 games taking place at the Madison Square Garden on ESPN. Both these games will be on ESPN. Miami at Tennessee is the first game, 6:30 Eastern time. FanDuel favors the Vols by 16.5. That's what happens when you're the number 1 team in the country playing a struggling team out of the ACC, especially after the SEC just walloped the ACC in that challenge last week. And then we got Michigan at Arkansas is the nightcap, 9 p.m. Eastern time, also at Madison Square Garden, also on ESPN. FanDuel has a much closer line there. That one has Michigan favored Dusty Mays Club by 4.5. I like both these matchups. Again, I think the expectation would have been more excitement for Miami at Tennessee than we're getting. And part of that is the hope that Jim Larrañaga, Coach L, would have found a way to kind of get this Miami program back on track. It just hasn't happened. It hasn't happened yet. They had a strong recruiting class. Jaleel Bethio is one of the top tier freshmen in the country, joins this program. They get Nigel Pack back. Sure, they lose some talent. Wooga Poplar hits the portal and goes to Villanova. They lose Norchad Omier to Baylor, but Lynn Kidd comes in. Again, Bethia comes in, Pack's back. Like, I think there was an expectation that this Miami team would compete to be a top 5, maybe even top 3 team in the ACC, and they just haven't looked it. They haven't looked it. Meanwhile, Tennessee has not struggled at all this season. They went and beat Louisville by 22 at Louisville's house. They got a win over Baylor. Like, this team has played really good ball as of late. I'm excited to see this matchup. It strikes me as a matchup of a lot of the veteran experience for Tennessee with Santiago Vescovi and even the new players, Chaz Lanier. He's new to the system, but he's a veteran, playing a lot of college basketball. Igor Milicic as well. Playing against a team in Miami that has some veterans. Obviously, we talked about Nigel Pack already. Lynn Kidd's been around the block for a while, but I think Tennessee's got the defense. They have the scoring mentality, especially with Lanier and Milicic playing the way that they have, that I think that they should deliver on this one and not only win it, but win it probably right around where that line is. I expect a comfortable 12, 15-ish point victory for the Vols over the Canes. For Michigan and Arkansas, fun matchup between two new coaches at new systems, replacing Juwan Howard and Eric Musselman. We have Dusty May at Michigan, of course, John Calipari at Arkansas. Fun matchup. To me, the excitement here is in the front court. I love watching Boogie Fland play basketball for Arkansas. I'm intrigued to see DJ Wagner continue to grow, hoping to eventually see John L. Davis. And that's a key matchup here too, because John L. Davis has not played like he did at Florida Atlantic under Coach Dusty May. Perhaps Nelly Davis will have something up his sleeve going against his former coach in Dusty May at Michigan. But in reality, this matchup is likely going to come down to the front court, because Michigan has really done well with their two big lineup of Vlad Golden and Danny Wolf. Those two guys have they just took it to Wisconsin in that game. They've played really well off of each other. Wolf can handle the ball a little bit more, can play away from the rim, whereas Golden's just kind of your enforcer down on the block. And I struggle to see how Arkansas is going to handle that. I think this is a fun game for scouts to really get a good look at Zvonimir Ivisic, the sophomore forward for Arkansas, who was at Kentucky last year. He's kind of been billed as this unicorn type who can space the floor, shoot threes, and protect the rim and be an impactful low-post defender. Time to prove it. This is a really good opportunity to prove that. Obviously, he'll get plenty more chances in the SEC, but this is a big-time game against a team that has two quality bigs and has a coach who really knows how to utilize them well. I'm very interested to see how Calipari attempts to defend this Michigan team and these two big lineups and kind of what that's going to look like. Do we see more playing time from Jonas Adu? Do they try to space the floor with Trevin Brazil in the game and potentially pull somebody like Golden away from the rim? Like, there's just a lot of intrigue in how this matchup goes. Ultimately, though, I do think Michigan wins, and I'm going to take them to cover that spread, that 4.5-point spread as well. Two more games to get to quickly. Two Big Ten matchups here as conference play has gotten underway for that conference. Penn State going on the road to Jersey Mike's Arena to take on Rutgers at 7 p.m. Eastern time. That game will be on Peacock. No FanDuel line as I'm recording this, but KenPom favors Penn State by 2. Nittany Lions are starting to pick up some votes in the AP poll. Rutgers not picking up votes anymore after a slow start to the season. For Rutgers, they have two phenomenal freshmen, Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper. Always fun to watch those two guys go to work. But the rest of the team just hasn't really stepped up for Steve Pikiell, and I think that'll continue to be the case. I think Penn State wins this one even on the road. And then Wisconsin at Illinois, 9 p.m., also on Peacock, State Farm Center, so a home game for Illinois. FanDuel favors the Illini by 5.5 in this one. That would be a third straight loss for Wisconsin. Very likely kicks them out of the top 25 if they don't get a W here. Could potentially push Illinois back into the top 25 after they fell out this last week. Fun matchup between some veteran guards for Wisconsin, including John Tonji, who's played phenomenal this year, and a much younger group of guards for Illinois, Kasparis Jakusionis, Will Riley, really phenomenal group of freshmen for this Illini team. Kylan Boswell feels like a big hinge in this game as well. He's kind of the defensive guard that Brad Underwood acquired in the transfer portal. How he defends Tanji is going to be a big hinge in how this game goes. I think Illinois wins. I think they cover that spread as well, win by 7, 8, 10 points, something like that. And I think we start to see Wisconsin, the wheels start to fall off a little bit for this Badgers team. We'll see how Greg Gard and company can kind of right the ship if they do take a loss here, their third in a row. It's going to wrap it up for me today on the Locked On College Basketball podcast, folks. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Special shout out to the everyday listeners. We will be back the rest of the week. We'll get you recaps on these games. We'll get you previews for the other exciting games coming up this week. Cyhawk is on Thursday, Iowa State at Iowa. We got a super great slate of games on Saturday as well. UConn, Gonzaga, Creighton at Alabama, handful of others as well. So look out for some previews for those games coming up. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, peace out.